They say the British made rubbish tanks during the Second World War. You've heard it. Of course you've heard it. It's in every YouTube thumbnail that slaps a red X over a Cromwell while bathing a Tiger One in golden light. It's in every War Thunder forum thread where someone ranks the British tech tree dead last. It's the background hum of every Reddit post that asks, why were British tanks so bad? A question that delivers its verdict before anyone bothers to answer. And it's wrong. Not completely wrong. That'd be too easy. British tanks weren't secretly brilliant. They weren't misunderstood masterpieces waiting for history to vindicate them. They were something far more interesting than that. They were rational. Every design decision, the slow speed, the small gun, the awkward shape, had a specific, documentable, defensible reason rooted in budget, doctrine, and physical infrastructure. And the myth that calls them rubbish? That myth comes from judging 1937 engineering with a 1943 answer key, which isn't analysis, it's hindsight cosplaying as intelligence. The myth didn't emerge from any battlefield. It emerged from a book, a pair of video games, and the ruthless economics of clickbait. Belton Cooper's Death Traps, published in 1998, recounts his time as an ordnance maintenance officer with the American 3rd Armored Division. His job was recovering destroyed Shermans. Think about what that means. He spent the entire war staring at the tanks that failed, the ones that burned. He never saw the ones that survived because those didn't need recovering. His book is vivid, harrowing, and enormously readable, which is exactly why it became a bestseller and exactly why its conclusions metastasized through popular culture. Historians like Stephen Zaloga have dismantled Cooper's statistical claims piece by piece, exposing the profound survivorship bias baked into every page. Didn't matter. The template was set. Allied tanks were inferior, German tanks were superior, and if the Sherman was a death trap, then the slower, more awkwardly armed British machines must have been even worse. The gaming community finished the job. In World of Tanks, British armour sits in the lower tiers of community rankings that prize speed and firepower above all else. War Thunder's British tree is punishing. It demands patience in a medium designed around aggression and twitch reflexes. For millions of players whose first encounter with a Matilda 2 happens through a screen, driving a slow infantry tank in a game that rewards rushing feels identical to driving a bad tank. The game mechanics don't model doctrine. They don't model railway loading gauges. They model penetration values and reload speed. Stripped of every scrap of context, a Matilda 2 is simply worse than a T-34. But that isn't history. That's arithmetic. And on one particular day in May 1940, the arithmetic was about to get humiliated by reality. But before we get there, before we get to the day a rubbish tank terrorized a panzer division, you need to understand why it was built the way it was. Because every decision that shaped the machine that rolled into Arras traces back to a Treasury meeting room in Whitehall, 21 years before the battle. August 1919, 9 months after the armistice. The Cabinet adopted the 10-year rule, a planning assumption that the British Empire wouldn't face a great war during the next decade. Reasonable enough. Europe was a graveyard. 750,000 British servicemen were dead. But in 1928, Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, argued that the rule should roll forward automatically, resetting the 10-year clock every single day unless the Cabinet explicitly voted to stop it. This sounds like bureaucratic minutiae. It was catastrophic. The military could never plan for a war sooner than a decade away. Every year the horizon retreated. Every year weapons development could be deferred because the next war was always comfortably far off. The rule was scrapped in March 1932. The Treasury immediately announced that abandonment didn't mean spending more money. Defence spending that year sat at roughly £102 million, covering the Royal Navy, the RAF, and the Army in that order. The Navy protected global trade routes. The RAF got increasing priority after Baldwin warned that the bomber will always get through. The Army got what was left, and tank development sat at the bottom of the Army's own priority list. No budget for prototyping. No budget for the build, test, break, redesign cycle that produces refined machines. The tank had to work close to right the first time. This produced two very different answers to the same question. The first answer was cheap. Sir John Carden at Vickers designed the A11, the Matilda I, as the most austere possible interpretation of the infantry tank concept. A mobile, armoured shield at rock-bottom cost. Carden used a commercial Ford V8 engine straight off the civilian production line. Steering components, transmission parts, suspension elements, all sourced from existing commercial suppliers wherever possible. The entire philosophy was built around the Treasury's implicit demand: give us something that works, and don't you dare ask for money to make it work well. The A11 carried a single Vickers .303 machine gun. No cannon, no anti-armour capability. It could suppress enemy infantry. It could not kill a tank. It cost approximately £6,000 per unit, a fraction of what a properly armed infantry tank would demand. It was a budget line item disguised as a fighting vehicle, and the Army accepted it because the alternative was having no infantry tanks at all. The A12, the Matilda II, was the answer they actually wanted but could barely afford. Heavier armour, cast rather than riveted in critical sections, a proper 2-pounder gun, twin AEC diesel engines instead of a single commercial petrol unit, and a price tag to match, roughly £5,000 more per tank than the A11, which doesn't sound dramatic until you multiply by hundreds and remember that the entire Army equipment budget was fighting the Navy and the RAF for scraps. Production was slow, tooling was complex, and by September 1939 the Army had received fewer than 2 dozen. The contrast between the two Matildas isn't a story about good design and bad design. It's a story about what happens when a nation tries to rearm on a budget that was starved for 13 years by a rolling planning assumption that the next war would never quite arrive. Now, Doctrine. The officers who wrote the tank specifications in the mid-1930s had survived the Western Front. They'd watched infantry advance unsupported into machine gun fire. The lesson they drew, and it was a rational lesson, was that the next European war would produce another stalemate, another grinding positional struggle. So they built a 2-tier system. Cruiser tanks, fast, light, designed to exploit breakthroughs. Infantry tanks, slow, heavy, designed to advance at walking pace alongside foot soldiers, absorb anti-tank fire, and get the men to the enemy trench alive. Speed wasn't just unnecessary, it was unwanted. An infantry tank that raced ahead of its troops had abandoned the men it existed to protect. The gun the Matilda II received was the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a 40mm anti-tank weapon that, when specified, was genuinely the finest anti-tank gun in the world. It could penetrate the armour of every tank in every army's inventory. The absence of a useful high-explosive round wasn't an engineering failure. It was a doctrinal choice. Tank guns killed tanks. High explosive support came from the Royal Artillery. The 2-pounder did exactly what it was asked to do. Nobody asked it to do enough. That was a failure of prophecy, not engineering. And the French reached identical conclusions. The Char B1, the Renault R35, the Maginot Line itself. Every continental military planner who'd witnessed the Western Front expected positional warfare. The British weren't uniquely wrong. They were conventionally wrong. Very different thing. Right, so you've got a tank designed under starvation budgets, built to a doctrine that anticipated trench warfare, armed with a gun that was best in class when it was chosen. Now put it on a battlefield and watch what happens. 21st of May 1940, Arras, northern France. And this is where the myth dies, if you're willing to look at what actually happened rather than what the scoreboard says. The British Expeditionary Force was being swallowed. German armour had punched through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse, and was sprinting for the Channel coast in a sickle cut that split the Allied armies clean in two. The BEF, the French First Army, and the Belgian forces were being herded into an ever-shrinking pocket against the sea. Communications were fragmenting. Command structures were buckling. Nobody had a clear picture of where the Germans actually were, and in the fog of a campaign moving faster than anyone had planned for, the British High Command made a decision born more of desperation than calculation. Counterattack southward from Arras. Try to cut the German corridor, buy time, do something, anything. The force assembled for this task was designated Frank Force, after its commander, Major General Harold Franklin. On paper, Franklin had 2 divisions at his disposal. In reality, the striking power available was pitiful. What actually went forward on the afternoon of 21st May amounted to 2 mobile columns built around the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments, supported by 2 battalions of the Durham Light Infantry, the 6th and 8th DLI, with a smattering of anti-tank guns and field artillery. The infantry rode in whatever transport could be scraped together. Coordination with the French, who were supposed to attack simultaneously from the east, was a mess. The French 3rd Division Légère Mécanique, equipped with Saumur S-35s, genuinely excellent tanks, was meant to cover the right flank and push alongside the British. But the 3rd DLM had been fighting for days already. Its units were scattered, its fuel situation dire, and coordination between French and British headquarters was hobbled by different radio frequencies, different map grids, and the fundamental chaos of a campaign where nobody's information was less than 12 hours stale. The French contribution, when it finally materialized, was limited and late. The British columns would be going in largely alone. 74 tanks. Sounds like a force. 58 of those were Matilda 1s, the A-11, the Ford-engined budget machine with its single machine gun. 16 were Matilda 2s, 16 gun tanks. That was the armoured fist sent to cut a corridor held by panzer divisions. The 2 columns split around 1400 hours. The right column, 7th RTR, with most of the Matilda 2s, accompanied by the 8th Durham Light Infantry, swung south and then west, pushing into the flank of the German advance. The left column, 4th RTR, heavier on Matilda 1s, with the 6th DL1, took a more westerly route toward Vai. There was no combined arms sophistication here, no air cover, no time for proper reconnaissance. Radio communication between the 2 columns was sporadic at best. The attack was less a coordinated assault than 2 armoured fingers groping southward into uncertainty. They groped straight into General Major Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, the formation already earning the name Ghost Division for the speed of its advance and its unnerving habit of vanishing from its own high command's situation maps. And then the Matildas hit the German line. The right column struck first, grinding into German positions near Wylie and Mercatel. The 7th Panzer's anti-tank screen opened fire. The standard German anti-tank gun in May 1940 was the 3.7cm Pak-36, a weapon that had performed adequately against Polish armour 9 months earlier and that the Wehrmacht considered reliable, competent, proven. Against the Matilda II, it was useless. Rounds struck the frontal armour and bounced. They hit the sides and bounced. German gun crews, well-trained and disciplined, fired and reloaded and fired again and watched their shells ricochet off into the dirt like gravel thrown at a cathedral wall. The Matildas kept coming. Slow, agonizingly, doctrinally slow, but unstoppable by anything in the German anti-tank inventory. The 37mm shells weren't just failing to penetrate, they weren't even making the crews inside flinch. The tank had been built to absorb exactly this caliber of fire, at exactly these ranges, while advancing at exactly this speed. It was doing, precisely, boringly, triumphantly, what the specification demanded. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. On the western edge of the attack, elements of the SS Division Totenkopf, Theodor Eicker's formation, recruited heavily from concentration camp guard units, ideologically fanatical, but with essentially no experience of actual combat, encountered the advancing British armour. They broke. Not withdrew, not fell back in good order. Broke. Troops fled south in panic, abandoning positions and equipment. Eicher himself later raged at the disgrace, but in the moment, his men looked at tanks their weapons couldn't hurt and ran. The Totenkopf suffered close to 200 casualties in the Arras fighting, a staggering toll for a brief encounter that the entire German command structure had expected to be a routine advance, not a desperate defensive action. An SS division, supposedly the hardest edge of the Nazi war machine, panicked in the face of 16 gun tanks advancing at walking pace. The left column, despite its preponderance of machine gun-only Matilda Is, created its own chaos simply by existing. British tanks, any British tanks, materializing where no resistance was expected, overrunning German transport columns and rear area units, scattering logistics troops. The 4th RTR pushed through positions that had never anticipated a fight, and the confusion their appearance caused was vastly disproportionate to their actual firepower. Perception trumped reality. The Germans didn't know most of those tanks couldn't shoot back at armour. They just knew tanks were behind them, and their anti-tank guns weren't working. Rommel was personally present. He was always personally present. It was both his greatest strength as a commander and his most dangerous habit. Finding his anti-tank guns useless and his infantry reeling, he improvised. He ordered 100 5mm field howitzers hauled into direct fire positions, barrels depressed to shoot flat at the approaching Matildas. He directed 88mm flak guns, anti-aircraft weapons never intended for ground combat, to be levelled against the British armour. The 88mm could do what the 37mm couldn't. It could penetrate the Matilda's armour. And it did. But hauling heavy flak guns into hasty positions under fire, manhandling them around to face a ground target while British tanks bore down on the gun crews, this was desperate, improvised, and nothing remotely like the controlled anti-tank defence the Wehrmacht had trained for. Rommel was making it up as he went. His reports to higher command were frantic. He estimated the attacking force at 5 divisions. 5 divisions. The actual force was 2 understrength battalions of infantry and 74 tanks, most of them armed with nothing but machine guns. Rommel, a general who would become the most celebrated armoured commander of the war, looked at the Frank force counterattack and saw an offensive 5 times larger than reality. Because the Matildas wouldn't die, because his standard anti-tank guns couldn't stop them, because the panic radiating outward from the point of contact was warping every report, every estimate, every assessment of what the British were actually doing. The counterattack didn't succeed in any strategic sense. It couldn't have. 16 gun tanks can't cut a corridor held by multiple panzer divisions, and by evening the British columns were withdrawing, having taken heavy losses, particularly among the Matilda Is, which were vulnerable to everything the Matilda IIs shrugged off. Dozens of tanks were knocked out or broke down. The infantry suffered badly. By the cold calculus of objectives achieved versus forces committed, Arras was a tactical failure. But that's not the whole story, not even close. The shock Arras sent through the German High Command was wildly disproportionate to the size of the force that caused it. Rommel's panicked reports of a massive British armoured assault rippled upward. Concern about further Anglo-French counterattacks against the exposed Panzer corridor, a corridor that had outrun its own infantry support and was dangerously thin, fed directly into the caution that produced one of the most debated decisions of the entire war: the Halt Order. On 24th May, 3 days after Arras, Hitler ordered the panzer divisions to stop their advance on Dunkirk. The reasons for that order are layered. Goering's promise that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, the need to preserve armour for the push south into France, the boggy ground around the Dunkirk perimeter. Historians still argue. But the anxiety created by Arras, the demonstrated fact that British armour could appear unexpectedly and survive everything the standard German anti-tank arsenal threw at it, was woven into the decision. That pause gave the BEF the breathing space to organise the evacuation. Over 338,000 Allied troops were pulled off the beaches. 16 Matilda IIs, advancing at walking pace, absorbing fire that should have killed them and didn't, helped make Dunkirk possible. A tank performing exactly as designed, against exactly the threats its armour was built to defeat, on the one day it mattered most. That isn't a rubbish tank. That's a machine doing its job. And it did it again. 7 months later, different desert, different enemy. Operation Compass, December 1940 through February 1941. Matilda IIs of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment rolled into Italian positions in the Western Desert, and the Italians discovered what the Germans at Arras already knew. Their anti-tank guns couldn't touch it. The troops gave the Matilda a name that stuck: the Queen of the Desert. One veteran account, passed down through family testimony, the kind of story grandfathers told, describes the interior turret walls glowing red from the heat of absorbed anti-tank rounds. Kinetic energy converting to thermal energy, the steel radiating a dull, hellish glow while the crew kept fighting. That's not a statistic. That's not 78 millimeters of cast armour on a spec sheet. That's a man watching the walls of his tank turn colour and staying at his gun because the armour is holding and the machine is doing what it was built to do. So why couldn't they just put a bigger gun on it when the threats changed? Why was the tank that terrorised Rommel at Arras stuck with a 40mm pop gun for its entire operational life? This is where the whole story pivots. And it has nothing to do with committees, paperwork, or institutional stupidity. It has to do with Victorian railway tunnels. The British railway loading gauge, the maximum physical envelope a vehicle must fit within to pass through tunnels, over bridges, past platforms, was and remains one of the most restrictive in the industrialised world. Military loads were permitted a maximum width of roughly 8 feet 11 inches, about 2.72 metres. Every British tank had to travel by rail from factory to depot to port, because road transport of heavy armour over long distances chewed up road surfaces and burned fuel the nation couldn't spare. Rail wasn't optional. Rail was the logistical spine of the home front. Here's the chain.
Tank width was capped by the railway loading gauge.
Tank width determined maximum turret ring diameter. Turret ring diameter determined maximum gun breech size. Gun breech size determined maximum caliber. This wasn't a chain of choices. It was a chain of physical impossibilities. The Matilda II's turret ring measured 54 inches, just under 1,400 millimeters. The 2-pounder fit. The 6-pounder, available from 1941 and desperately needed as German armour thickened, required a larger breech and longer recoil stroke. It wouldn't fit. Not because nobody thought of it, because a Victorian railway tunnel somewhere in the Midlands was 9 inches too narrow. The Soviets had broad-gauge rail, 1,520 millimeters between the rails versus Britain's 1,435, and a correspondingly generous loading gauge. The T-34 mounted a 76mm gun, then an 85mm. The Americans had the Association of American Railroads loading gauge, substantially larger, and a continental road network that reduced the absolute dependence on rail. The Sherman accepted a 75mm, then a 76mm. The Matilda was stuck with its 40mm for life. Not because of stupidity, because of infrastructure built by Victorians who had no reason to imagine that the width of a railway cutting in Staffordshire would one day determine whether a tank crew could kill a Panzer III. And there's a small, perfect irony buried in the production records. A significant proportion of Matilda II's were built by the Vulcan Foundry in Newton-le-Willows, Lancashire, a firm whose primary business since 1830 was manufacturing railway locomotives. The same railway system whose loading gauge constrained the tank's design was the industrial base that built it. The machine and its limitation born from the same source. So what happened to the rubbish tank after it became obsolete? It refused to go away. Matilda II's were withdrawn from frontline service in the Western Desert as the 6-pounder became essential. But they weren't scrapped. They became training vehicles. They were fitted with dozer blades and converted into engineering tanks for clearing obstacles and preparing positions. Some were sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, where they served on the Eastern Front. The Soviets found them slow and undergunned for their operational conditions, which was fair, but they used them anyway, because a tank with armour that works is a tank you can use. And then there was the Pacific. The Australians received Matilda II's and took them to war in terrain that would have made a tiger driver weep. Jungle, mud that swallowed wheels and tracks, dense vegetation where engagement ranges dropped to 50 metres or less, and speed was meaningless because nobody was going anywhere fast. The Australian 2/4th Armoured Regiment operated Matildas in Borneo and Bougainville through 1944 and into 1945. They weren't using them as museum pieces, they were using them because the Matilda's heavy armour, low speed and infantry support design philosophy, the very qualities that made it obsolete on the open deserts and plains of the European theatre, were exactly what jungle warfare demanded. Thick armour to shrug off Japanese anti-tank fire at point-blank range. Slow, deliberate pace to stay with infantry picking their way through impossible terrain. The Australians adapted them further. The Frog variant replaced the main gun with a flamethrower, turning the Matilda into something nightmarish, a slow, invulnerable steel beast that advanced through the jungle, spraying fire into bunker slits and defensive positions that conventional weapons couldn't reach. The Hedgehog variant carried a naval mortar system adapted for land use, lobbing demolition charges into fortified positions. These weren't desperate improvisations with obsolete equipment. They were creative engineering solutions that exploited the Matilda's strengths, armour, reliability, a chassis that could carry heavy modifications, in a theatre where its weaknesses didn't matter. A tank supposedly obsolete by 1942 was still in combat 3 years later on the other side of the world, fitted with weapons its original designers couldn't have imagined, fighting a war its original doctrine never anticipated. Some were captured by the Germans, some by the Italians. And here's the point nobody who calls the Matilda rubbish ever addresses. The enemy used them. If your opponent picks up your rubbish tank off the battlefield and puts their own crews in it, that tells you the machine works. After the war, surviving hulls found their way into agricultural and engineering roles. Dozer tanks, tractors, industrial machines. Hulls that had glowed red in the western desert, that had bounced 37mm rounds at Arras, that had spat fire in Borneo. They ended up pushing dirt and clearing land. A machine that was obsolete by 1942 outlasted the entire war it fought in, and then kept working. That's not the biography of a rubbish tank. Look, the Matilda had real problems. The speed was painful. The twin AEC diesels were a maintenance nightmare. The 2-pounder lacked a useful high-explosive round. The turret was cramped. The design couldn't grow when the war changed around it. All true, every word. But every one of those problems traces to a rational cause. Speed was slow because Doctrine demanded walking pace. The gun was small because the railway loading gauge wouldn't permit a wider turret ring. The design couldn't evolve because the budget never allowed for iterative development that builds in room to grow. These weren't engineering failures. They were consequences of constraints, doctrine, budget, infrastructure, that became outdated faster than the machines could adapt. At Arras, on one spring afternoon in 1940, 16 of these constrained, compromised, rubbish machines rolled into a panzer division and caused enough panic to help buy time for 338,000 men to escape across the Channel. The tank performed exactly as specified, against exactly the threats it was armoured to defeat. That the war turned out to be a different war, faster, more mobile, demanding bigger guns and more flexible doctrine, is tragedy, not incompetence. Yes, there was always something wrong with them. And yes, they were really good. Both of those things are true. That's the point. If you want more stories that treat history with context instead of scorecards, subscribe and stick around.